Y'all ever hear of the disgusting slave owner that got all of her slaves repoed? Actually, you guys have, because I've covered her.
Hi guys, welcome back to our channel. In case you're new here, my name is Maren.
And I'm Maureen.
Right, so guys, in today's episode, we are going to be covering 3 stories of slaves who got their reparations before they died and took their slave masters with them.
Right, so in these stories, I think I was particularly drawn to the third one, where it involved this slave master being not only a crazy but also a mad scientist. So you guys, you can imagine the kind of crazy things that went on in her plantation.
Personally, I feel like I was drawn to the first story, but guys, what are we talking about? Let's just watch and then we come back and talk about it. You let us know what you think about this episode in the comment section, and also consider subscribing if it's your first time here. Let's watch.
Y'all ever hear the story of the little slave girl that was bought as a concubine and was tired of her master essaying her, so she killed his ass? Get your popcorn. This story takes place in Callaway County, Missouri in 1855. A man by the name of Robert Newsom bought a slave by the name of Celia. Robert purchased Celia a year after his wife passed away to do the cooking and cleaning of his plantation. But that's not the only reason why he bought Celia. He owned 5 other slaves, which were all men, but he wanted little Celia to be his concubine. So this middle-aged man made the journey to go find a woman slave and brought her back. As soon as he reached home, the carriage wasn't even unpacked yet, he essayed her. And this began a long 5.5-year journey of him essaying Celia. She did cook and clean his plantation, his house, and served his grown children, but she was seen as a sexual object to Robert. Like I said, he lived with his adult children. Her cabin was only 50 feet from the home. So everybody knew, as quiet as kept, what he was sneaking out every single night and doing to Celia. They all act like it wasn't happening, but it absolutely was. 2 years after she arrived at the plantation, she became pregnant and gave birth to a mulatto child that belonged to Robert. Then 2 years after that, she was forced to give birth to another one of his kids. But what nobody expected is after her second child, she actually fell in love with one of Robert's other slaves named George. And by all accounts, they had a consensual relationship. They were in love. But even though she was in a relationship with George, she still was being essayed by Robert. After 5 years of all of this, George and Celia had enough. So George gave her an ultimatum. Either you tell him to stop this shit or we're done. I can't do this no more. Fearing losing George, she went to Robert and told him, I'm not doing this no more, which was actually really brave for that time. But Robert was like, yeah, whatever, I'll see you in your cabin tonight. And at that moment, he fucked around and he was about to find out. And I forgot to mention, at this point, she was pregnant with her 3rd child. And she didn't know if it was George's or if it was Robert's. So after she already had asked nicely, she went out to the woods, picked up the biggest branch stick that she could muster, because remember, she's pregnant, and put it in the corner of her cabin and waited. It must be added that she had very, very bad morning sickness and had already begged Robert to leave her the fuck alone. It's not like this was just like the first time she had asked him to stop. She had asked him several times to lay off her. So that night, Robert wobbled his 60-year-old ass into her cabin, like he did every night, and Celia grabbed the stick that she had collected earlier in the day to ward him off and told him, like, don't come no closer, all right? And this heartless old bastard was doing this in front of her kids. Like, they lived in a little cabin, so he was S.A.ing her in front of her kids. When he didn't back up, she whacked his ass over the head. And to make sure he ain't get back up, she continuously bludgeoned him. And she said, and I quote, the devil got into me. That wasn't the devil, them was the ancestors getting their reparations. She beat his skull in. Once she knew he was good and dead, she rolled his ass into the fire and tended to it all night. She barbecued his ass to ash and bones. Ashe. The larger bones that were not disintegrated by the fire, she crushed them And then she put him in the floorboards, like pushed him through the floorboards of her cabin. So after a long sleepless night of doing the good Lord's work, she went to sleep. She got up right before noon and started spying on the family because, of course, they're looking for Robert. But then she noticed that the ash in her fireplace was far too much. It would have looked suspicious. It looked weird. So she commissioned Robert's 12-year-old grandson, Coffee, who also lived on the plantation with them, to dispose of his grandfather unknowingly. Sis was low-key a savage. So she told Coffee, I'll give you 24 walnuts if you clean out my fireplace and get rid of the ashes. And he was super excited because apparently he loved walnuts. So he gathered his grandfather's ashes and scattered them down the pathway all the way to a stable that was on the property. So after Robert was missing for 12 hours, his grown kids was like, we're going to go talk to Celia. The same person that they didn't even think anything was going on between them two. Why would you go to her cabin first if you knew that nothing was going on? After basically interviewing her for hours, she finally caved in and told them what she had done. She was arrested, but what makes this case very, very interesting is that they didn't immediately hang her. Back then, even in this old time in the state of Missouri, a woman had a God-given right to kill a man that essayed her. But because she was an enslaved woman, that didn't apply to her. But her defense did go back and forth for months over this, giving out all of the counties and state laws to try to get Cecilia off. During this time, somewhere between October and December, she had given birth and it was a stillborn. She was so stressed out during this whole trial period that she lost her baby. The judge acknowledged that this was a law and that technically she should be protected under it, but because she was 1/4 a human, he wouldn't hear of it. So on December 21st, 1855, 19-year-old Celia was walked to the gallows and hung. Her 2 biracial daughters were sold to Harry Newsom, which was Robert Newsom's son. So he basically bought his sisters. This story had no real spiritual reparations because there's not much else on the internet about her, but she got her reparations up front. And I'm pretty sure she'd do it again. Do good and be good. Have you ever heard the story about the little slave girl that poisoned her whole master's family and then haunted the place for all of eternity? Get your popcorn. On today's edition of Fuck Around and Find Out, the spiritual reparations version, we have the haunting of Myrtle's Plantation. It's in St. Francisville, Louisiana. Today it is a beautiful bed and breakfast, as all plantations turn into spirit. The story started off with newlyweds purchasing this plantation, and they were Mr. and Mrs. Woodruff. Mr. Woodruff was a judge, but he took a particular liking and hating to one of his slaves named Chloe. He would physically, verbally, and mentally abuse this girl. She had to be anywhere between 13 and 16 years old. Of course, he SA'd her frequently and was just a nasty colonizer. He was terrible to Chloe, and Chloe wanted to do something to try to get into his good graces. She was tired. So she decided that one day that she was going to eavesdrop on one of his conversations to try to get some tea on how to make him calm down, like trying to help herself, basically. But Mr. Woodruff caught her eavesdropping. Instead of sending her away like a normal person would do, he had to make an example out of her. So this grown man cut off both of her ears. She was so ashamed. She was embarrassed, humiliated, so she took to wearing a green turban to cover her missing ears and scars. But Chloe was pissed, and she was not going to let him play her like that. Now, the next part of this story is what I like to call swamp talk, because this potaki, the story, changes depending on who you're talking to. Some say it was an accident, others say it was on purpose. I'm more inclined to believe that she did this on purpose. And no, I do not support the unaliving of children or anyone, but this is what she came to. On Mr. Woodruff's daughter's 9th birthday, Chloe put Orlander, and sorry if I'm saying it wrong, correct me y'all, Orlander leaves in the cake. Now, around the bayou, some say that she was only trying to poison Mrs. Woodruff and the children so that she can nurse them back to health and be back in Mr. Woodruff's good graces. Others say that she wanted him to experience a loss as significant as she did, if not worse. Either way, the dose was lethal. It ended up killing Mrs. Woodruff and 2 of her kids. Y'all heard the saying, all kinfolk ain't skinfolk. So news of this spread amongst slaves and got back to Mr. Woodruff. So he hung Chloe. And it's been on and cracking ever since then. Some say she cursed this house before he hung her, but spiritual reparations definitely commenced after he hung her. After he hung her, he put some bricks on her body and threw her in the Mississippi River. Everyone that purchased this plantation after the Woodruffs suffered or died or something. Right after the Woodruffs, owned the plantation, a man and his 5 children bought it, and the man and 4 of his children died of tuberculosis in the house. The house was then passed down to the man's surviving daughter. So she and her husband occupied the place. They were the Winters. Mr. Winters was a Sunday school teacher. He taught Sunday school to children on this plantation. One day, a man came to the front of this plantation and yelled for him to come outside. Upon him going outside, he shot Mr. Winters. People still complain about hearing his footsteps and the drop of his body on the porch. The movie The Long Hot Summer was actually filmed in this plantation, and it was so haunted that the cast and crew was like, nah. They couldn't wait for this movie to wrap up. I mean, furniture was moving around, they would see apparitions, but they also seen a young Black woman in a green turban just walking around the house. In the 70s, Chloe decided that she was going to bump up the activity. New owners purchased this plantation and wanted to insure it, and the insurance company required them to take pictures of the property to make sure that the property was in good condition. So he took the pictures as required, and y'all, Chloe's full apparition showed up in one of his pictures that he was intending to send to the insurance company, not to prove any paranormal activity, but to get the house insured. Y'all see that? You can see her turban, the whole outlining of her body. She's transparent. You can even see the panelings behind her. There's also a haunted mirror inside of the house. When people look in it, they say they can see Chloe. They also complain of seeing the Woodruff children. This spot up here on the mirror will not go away. They have resilvered it. They have replaced the mirror, and it always comes back. Like I said, this is a bed and breakfast today, but it's also considered to be one of the most haunted houses in America. Do good and be good. Y'all ever hear of the disgusting slave owner that got all of her slaves repoed? Actually, you guys have, because I've covered her. But I have more tea. Y'all remember the story of Marie Delphine Lalaurie in the Lalaurie Mansion? If you're new here, then go ahead and find that video. It should be on my playlist of haunted plantations. I'm going to give you a quick synopsis. In my original video, I took you guys down a journey of a slave owner in New Orleans who was so terrible to her slaves that the community rallied up against her and repoed her slaves. Then she bought them back. She had one of her family members go down there and get her slaves back. But some of my followers gave me some tea. And when I say tea, baby, I mean tea. So at the end of my original story, the Lalaurie Mansion went up in flames and it was set on fire by a 70-year-old slave who was trying to commit suicide. She ran off into the sunset and went to France and lived a quiet life, or so they wanted us to believe. A lot of you guys have heard about this story on American Horror Story Coven. And the ending of that episode, what happened to Marie, was a stark difference from what historians say happened. So my followers who are from the area, born and raised, and got the pot of keef from their ancestors, put me up on game. So not only was she horrible to her slaves, she was also a cannibal. She was eating them. She was also doing medical experimentation on these people. She was making human centipedes out of enslaved people. This serial killer was unhinged. Because anytime you piss off your own people who are doing slightly similar things to you, that means you're gone too far, mama. But it's also said that she was practicing voodoo. Her and her husband, Louis. They actually blame Louis more than they blame her. And while he was doing this medical experiment One of his slaves were they were doing ritualistic medical practices. And one of the spirits came to him in the fire that he had, and he turned his back and ignored the help of the Loi. So it is said that she made it out of New Orleans before the mob came into her house to arrest her or do whatever they was going to do. But here's tea. She never made it out of New Orleans. See, what most people don't know back then, New Orleans was a hub for free black folk. And with the help of this free queen, the queen of voodoo herself, Madame Laveau, old girl never had a chance to make it out of New Orleans. Because it is said that this voodoo queen, along with a couple other priestess, got to that ass. It just makes my little black soul smile that she got the ending that she deserved. Aight, boo-boo.
So guys, welcome back. Let us know what you think about the video we put together for you. So, let's talk about the first story first, yeah? Celia and Robert. Can you imagine this girl was only 19 years old, and at 19 years old, she had given birth to 3 children.
Yeah, and it wasn't like in a willing way or in a loving relationship. It was out of SA, And this man, he was old enough to be her grandfather. He knew what he was doing. Not only him, but he had also older kids who could have stopped him from doing that. But I guess back in those days, they were
Black lives didn't matter.
Not to them, at least. And when this guy finally disappeared, is when these kids start to pretend like they knew he disappeared while being in Celia's home.
Yeah, and guys, I just think to myself and I ask myself, you have to be a very special type of evil for you to sit around and something is being done in your house and you don't speak up against it. Instead, for you, it's like it's easier for you to not acknowledge the situation or pretend that it's not happening. But the person who's being harmed, she was young, she was a child, She was a child, her brain hadn't even developed yet. Because you see, even the way she was conducting herself, it's like for her to get to a point where she had had enough of Robert, she was still a child, with nobody to protect her.
Yeah, I mean, my biggest question on Celia's case is when she was finally unalived and her daughters were sold to their brother.
Right.
My question is, I'd just love to know what happened to those daughters under their brother's care, because I'm pretty sure it wasn't all tender care for them.
The apple does not fall far from the tree. But one thing I know is that, can you imagine you guys, despite this lady getting a partner and telling her that Robert to stop what he was doing, he still felt entitled enough to continue doing the harm he was doing to Celia, even in front of her children.
Yeah, right, even in front of her children. And this is one of those cases I would say he got what he deserved, and he deserved what he got.
Right. I feel like he died too soon. I don't know if according to how they've written the story, I don't know if Celia took time with him, but I have a feeling she did. But I still feel like he went too soon.
She didn't take time with him. I think she only took time when it came to
cooking him.
But taking time with unaliving him, it was a one-time thing. Quick, and you're done with the job.
Like she should have broken those bonds first. Anyway, guys. And guys, this is just my personal opinion, okay? We have seen descendants of slaves. Let's look at the case of Robert, his children, and the biracial babies he got with Celia, right? They ended up selling, it's like they were treating them like property. They ended up selling these kids, despite the trauma these kids had been through, they sold them to their brother. So what I'm asking myself, what is sparing this child from facing the same fate their mother did? You understand? And then another thing I wanted to say, you guys, can we just be fair by saying, this is just my personal opinion, okay? Anybody who's known and believed to have been a descendant of a slave owner, there's one famous actor, I've forgotten his name, who really plays these roles well, and it was exposed that he came from a very
long line of slave owners,
and
his family back in the day owned slaves,
and they thrived and they are rich, like super rich because of that. And I'm saying, knowing the history history of slavery, those people who normally say our ancestors are the ones who did us, not us, so they don't want to be held accountable for these things, right? But this guy, the actor, who is known to have come from a long line of slaves, they're still enjoying
Slave owners.
Yeah, they're still enjoying the benefits because the backbone of their success was built on owning slaves. You understand? So my personal opinion would be, why? Because you know the inhumane things that slaves had to be put through in the hands of these slave owners. When you're talking about reparations, why can't we start with every other thing that was gained by such families in terms of wealth and everything? Why don't you take them and give it to the descendants of the slaves that you were mistreating and dehumanizing? Because at the end of the day, if you say you are not your ancestors, you're not your forefathers, but you're sitting in that house enjoying the fruits of their hands, and if you reflect that to the black community who are owned as slaves, their descendants are still facing, like, let me ask, they're still facing the effects of what had happened to their forefathers by such owners of slaves. You understand what I'm saying? So if you're talking about reparations, I feel like it's quite fair to say that also those ones who are affected, such people, relatives like Celia, people who came from Celia, like the biracial kids, if there's a long life of other people who came after that and were affected by such things, I feel like it's just right for them to be compensated. You understand?
And in the last story, guys, the cannibal woman and mad scientist who was rumored to have been gotten by the high priestess from the black community, and nobody knows what happened to her after that. We leave that to your imagination, because we can imagine what happened to her. And yeah, so guys, before we leave, kindly remember to subscribe to our channel if you're new to this channel. Also leave us a comment on what you think about this episode, and we'll see you on our next episode.